Reinhard Heydrich died on 4 June 1942 in Prague, but the shadow he cast did not die with him. His widow Lena and their children remained tied to one of the most feared figures of the Third Reich, long after the guns fell silent. When Germany collapsed in May 1945, they lost their estate, their protection, and their place in Hitler's world. What followed were years of interrogations, denazification hearings, legal battles, and a life lived under a name many wish to forget. But for Lena Heydrich, the war was only beginning. While the men who built the Nazi regime faced trials, executions, and imprisonment, the women and children they left behind entered a different kind of reckoning. One played out in courtrooms, on desolate roads fleeing advancing armies, and in the quiet decades of a defeated Germany that struggled to confront its past. Reinhard Heydrich met Lena von Osten on 6 December 1930 at a rowing club ball in Kiel. She was 19 years old, the daughter of a minor German aristocrat who worked as a village school teacher on the Baltic island of Fehmarn. The connection between them was immediate. Lena was already a convinced National Socialist, having joined the Nazi Party in 1929 with membership number 1201380, well before Hitler's rise to power. Her brother Hans had introduced her to the movement, speaking highly of its vision for national renewal. She attended a rally where Hitler spoke and found herself swept up in enthusiasm. When she met the tall, blonde naval lieutenant Reinhard Heydrich at that ball in Kiel, she saw a man who matched her ideological convictions and her ambitions. The early months of 1931 brought a turning point that would shape both their lives. Heydrich faced a naval inquiry for becoming engaged to Lena while still committed to another woman. The scandal reached Admiral Erich Raeder, who dismissed Heydrich from the Navy in April 1931 for conduct unbecoming an officer and gentleman. The dismissal devastated Heydrich. He found himself without career prospects, adrift at 27 years old with no clear path forward. Lena, however, saw opportunity where Heydrich saw ruin. She persuaded him to look into the recently formed Schutzstaffel, the SS, as a career option. Her political connections proved decisive. Karl von Eberstein, a friend of both the von Osten and Heydrich families and an associate of SS leader Heinrich Himmler, arranged an interview. When Himmler cancelled the appointment at the last minute, Lena ignored the message, packed Reinhard's suitcase and sent him to Munich anyway. Eberstein met Heydrich at the railway station and brought him to see Himmler. The SS chief asked Heydrich to sketch out his ideas for developing an SS intelligence service. Himmler was so impressed that he hired Heydrich on the spot as chief of what would become the Sicherheitsdienst, the SD. Heydrich entered the Hamburg SS on 14th July 1931, and his ascent through the Nazi hierarchy began. The couple married at a small church in Grossenbrode on 26 December 1931. Lena later stated that Reinhard never actually read Hitler's book, Mein Kampf, yet he would become one of the regime's most effective and feared architects of terror. Over the next decade, Heydrich rose to become one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany. He combined the SD with the Gestapo and the criminal police to form the Reich Security Main Office, the RSHA, a vast apparatus of surveillance, arrest. Adolf Hitler himself called Heydrich the man with the iron heart. Walter Schellenberg, who worked under Heydrich and observed him closely, later described him as a cruel, brave and cold intelligence, for whom truth and goodness had no intrinsic meaning. He was the founding head of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing units that murdered more than 2 million people, including 1.3 million Jews, by mass shooting and gassing in the occupied territories. On 20th January 1942, Heydrich chaired the Wannsee Conference in a villa by a lake in a wealthy suburb of Berlin, where 15 high-ranking officials gathered to coordinate what they called the final solution to the Jewish question, the systematic murder of 11 million European Jews. Throughout this period, Lena Heydrich gave birth to 4 children. Klaus arrived on 17th June 1933, followed by Haida on 23rd December 1934, Silke on 9th April 1939, and Marta on 23rd July 1942, 6 weeks after her father's death. By the late 1930s, Reinhard's duties kept him away from home for long stretches, leaving Lena alone with the children and the household. The strain nearly ended their marriage and divorce, but the couple reconciled, and Reinhard was especially close to his daughter Silke, proudly showing her off to visitors. In September 1941, Heydrich received his final major appointment. He became acting Reichsprotector of the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia, the Nazi designation for occupied Czechoslovakia. The family moved to the lower castle of Panenské Břežany, a grand estate originally owned by Ferdinand Bloch-Bauer, a Jewish sugar magnate whose property had been confiscated after he fled to Switzerland. Heydrich's rule combined calculated terror with economic incentives. He proclaimed martial law upon arrival, executing 142 people within 5 days. According to his own estimates, between 4,000 and 5,000 people were arrested, and between 400 and 500 executed by February 1942. Those not executed were sent to Mauthausen concentration camp, where only 4% of Czech prisoners survived the war. Yet Heydrich also increased food rations for industrial workers and granted workers paid holidays, calculating that productivity would rise if open resistance could be crushed while basic needs were met. At the estate, Lena hosted events for SS families and maintained social ties within the Nazi elite. According to post-war testimony from survivors, approximately 30 Jewish forced laborers worked on the estate, and Lena physically abused them. She reportedly watched the workers through binoculars from her balcony and ordered brutal punishments. A witness testified that whenever the Heydrich children saw the Jewish prisoners, they spat on them. After the war, when Lena faced denazification proceedings, she told the tribunal, "I never felt empathy for the Jews, and that was in line with the German folk." The Czechoslovak government in exile in London, along with the British Special Operations Executive, had been planning Heydrich's assassination almost from the moment he arrived in Prague. The operation was codenamed Anthropoid. František Moravec, chief of Czechoslovak military intelligence, personally briefed Brigadier Colin Gubbins of the SOE, who agreed to help mount the operation. Out of 2,000 exiled Czechoslovak soldiers based in Britain, Warrant Officer Josef Gabčík, a Slovak, and Staff Sergeant Jan Kubiš, a Czech, were selected to carry out the mission. They trained at SOE facilities in Scotland and England, learning demolitions and the methods of attacking a moving vehicle. On the night of 24th December 1941, a Royal Air Force Halifax bomber dropped Gabčík and Kubiš near Nevězdy, east of Prague. Navigation errors scattered the various groups far from their intended landing zones. The two assassins made contact with Czech resistance networks and spent months preparing, building a detailed picture of Heydrich's movements. Local resistance leaders, fearing catastrophic reprisals, begged the government in exile to call off the attack. But Edvard Beneš, head of the exile government, personally insisted that Operation Anthropoid proceed. On the morning of 27 May 1942, at approximately 10:30, Heydrich began his daily commute from Panenské Břežany to his headquarters at Prague Castle. He was driven by SS Oberscharführer Johannes Klein in a green, open-topped Mercedes 320 cabriolet. Heydrich was supremely confident, even arrogant, spurning normal security. Precautions. Gabčík and Kubiš waited at a tram stop near Bulovka Hospital at a tight curve where the car would have to slow down. Josef Valčík of Silva. A group stood about 100 meters away to signal when the car approached. As the Mercedes rounded the corner, Gabčík stepped into the road, dropped his raincoat and raised his Steen submachine gun. The gun jammed. Instead of ordering his driver to accelerate away, Heydrich made what proved to be a fatal error. He stood up and drew his Luger pistol, yelling at Klein to halt. As Klein braked, Kubiš threw a modified anti-tank grenade. It detonated against the rear wheel, sending shrapnel through the car's right fender and into Heydrich's body. Horsehair from the car's upholstery penetrated his wounds. Both Heydrich and Klein leapt out with pistols drawn. Heydrich tried to chase Gabčík but suddenly doubled over in pain and collapsed. Klein pursued Kubiš, who despite being mildly injured by shrapnel, managed to pedal away on his bicycle. Heydrich was evacuated to Bulovka Hospital, where surgeons removed his damaged spleen and attempted to stabilize his condition. For several days, he appeared to recover. Then septicemia set in. On 4 June 1942, Reinhard Heydrich died of his wounds at the age of 38, becoming the highest-ranking Nazi official to be assassinated during the entire war. For Lena and the children, the impact was immediate and devastating. Hitler sent condolences and promised to support the family. He confirmed their right to remain at the Jungfernbräuchen estate. Himmler delivered the key address at a lavish state funeral in Berlin on 9 June. Yet even as the family mourned, Nazi reprisals descended on Czechoslovakia with merciless fury. Hitler initially ordered the execution of 10,000 randomly selected Czechs, but Karl Hermann Frank convinced him that such indiscriminate killing would reduce productivity in the vital Czech arms industry. Instead, more targeted but still massive reprisals followed. More than 13,000 people were arrested. The villages of Lidis and Ležáky were destroyed based on false intelligence linking them to the assassins. On 10 June 1942, all male inhabitants of Lidis aged 14 and above, an estimated 340 people, were shot. The women and most of the children were deported to concentration camps. The village was burned to the ground. The assassins themselves were eventually betrayed. On 18 June 1942, German troops surrounded the Orthodox Church of St. Cyril and Methodius in Prague, where 7 resistance fighters, including Gabčík and Kubiš, had taken refuge. A gun battle lasting several hours ensued. 2 men were killed in the upper part of the church. Kubiš died shortly after from wounds incurred in the firefight. The remaining 4, including Gabčík, held out in the crypt as German soldiers tried to flush them out with gunfire, tear gas, and flooding. When they ran out of ammunition, the 4 took their own lives rather than be captured. The mass murder operation that followed in the occupied territories was codenamed Operation Reinhard in Heydrich's honor. In the extermination camps of Bełżec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, approximately 1.7 million Jews were murdered between 1942 and 1943. The systematic genocide Heydrich had coordinated at Wannsee continued without him. Tragedy struck the Heydrich family again on 24 October 1943. Klaus, the eldest son, now 10 years old, was cycling with his brother Heider on the grounds of the estate. Seeing that the gates to the street were open, Klaus rode out onto the road and was struck by a small truck. He died from his injuries later that afternoon. Hitler sent condolences once more, and SS figures attended the funeral. Lena mentioned Klaus's death repeatedly in interviews for the rest of her life, describing it as the most devastating blow she had ever suffered. The war that had claimed her husband now claimed her son. The final months of the war brought rapid changes. By April 1945, Soviet forces were approaching Prague. Lena gathered her 3 surviving children, Heider, Silke, and Mate, and fled west toward Bavaria, joining thousands of other Germans streaming away from the advancing Red Army. At the end of the war, Lena made a desperate decision. She entrusted her 2 eldest surviving children, Heider and Silke, to almost complete strangers and trusted them to return the children to Fehmarn, the Baltic island where she had grown up. Remarkably, they arrived safely at their grandparents' home. Lena herself took the youngest daughter, Mate, and made her way across country in a makeshift caravan, eventually reaching Fehmarn via the home of Frieda Wolf in Rotash. By the end of 1945, Lena and the children had settled temporarily in Aschau im Chiemgau, Bavaria, living in circumstances far removed from the status they once enjoyed. The British Army occupied their house on Fehmarn but moved out later that year, allowing the family to return. Their circumstances were austere. They relied on small stipends, support from extended family, and temporary housing arranged by local authorities. The loss of property, income, and political protection marked the start of a new phase in their lives, one defined by denazification hearings, interrogations, and a long struggle to rebuild an identity in post-war Germany. Denazification was the central process shaping Lena's post-war existence. From 1946 onward, she faced a series of hearings in Bavaria designed to determine her political responsibility and eligibility for public benefits. The Allied-run tribunals examined her early support for National Socialism, her marriage to a senior SS official, and the material advantages she had received during the Third Reich. Under the Law for Liberation from National Socialism and Militarism, passed on 5 March 1946, Germans were classified into 5 categories: major offenders, activists, lesser offenders, followers, and exonerated. Persons. Each classification carried different sanctions, from imprisonment and property confiscation to fines and employment restrictions. Lena had joined the Nazi Party in 1929, well before Hitler's rise to power. Investigators noted that her early membership suggested conviction, not coercion. They emphasized her close involvement in elite SS social circles, which gave her access to political networks and influence. Lena rejected this interpretation, repeatedly insisting she had played no part in her husband's work. She portrayed herself as a politically passive wife who knew nothing about Reinhard Heydrich's crimes at the RSHA. By 1949, Lena had been classified as a Mitläuferin, a follower. rather than an active supporter. This was the second lowest category, carrying minimal sanctions. A West German Denazification tribunal ordered her to pay 75 Deutschmarks in 3 installments of 25. The fine was almost laughably light given her husband's central role in the Holocaust. Some scholars have questioned whether Lena's testimony, which portrayed her as politically passive, influenced the outcome more than it should have. Others argue that the courts were bound by legislative definitions that made little room for moral considerations. Either way, the classification allowed her to avoid major penalties. In Czechoslovakia, however, Lena was tried in absentia and sentenced to life imprisonment for her treatment of Jewish forced labourers at the estate. The Czech court found her guilty of mistreating Jewish workers, feeding them table scraps, and ordering her household staff to beat them with whips and clubs. Testimony recorded that Lena personally kicked labourers and once waited 4 days to get an injured prisoner to a hospital after he was hit by a falling tree. She evaded this sentence by remaining in West Germany, which did not extradite her. Lena still faced financial hardship, having lost the family estate in Czechoslovakia and possessing no formal occupation. Throughout the late 1940s and early 1950s, she sought recognition as the widow of a German officer, which would entitle her to a pension under German law. Her case hinged on a technical question that sparked considerable controversy. Was Reinhard Heydrich, despite his SS rank, still considered a member of the German military at the time of his death? In 1954, a Munich court delivered a controversial decision. The judges ruled that Heydrich, as the chief of the Reich Security Main Office, had still held a qualifying status under military service regulations. This meant that Lena was entitled to a widow's pension. The decision sparked public debate. Critics argued that a man widely known as one of the regime's most powerful and feared security officials, the architect of the Wannsee Conference and the orchestrator of the Einsatzgruppen, should not be treated as a fallen soldier deserving of survivor benefits. Supporters of the ruling emphasized the narrow legal criteria involved, not moral judgment. Through a series of additional court cases against the West German government in 1956 and 1959, Lena secured her right to a substantial pension because her husband was technically a German police general killed in action. The government had previously declined to pay because of Heydrich's role in the Holocaust. The ruling became a touchstone in broader discussions about post-war justice and memory. It illustrated how the West German legal system, constrained by narrow statutory definitions, often failed to account for the moral dimensions of Nazi crimes when adjudicating pension claims and property disputes. By the early 1950s, Lena had completed the formal stages of denazification. She was legally permitted to work, travel, and receive state support. With her pension secured, she began rebuilding her life in a new direction. The family eventually settled permanently on the island of Fehmarn, off the northern coast of West Germany. There, Lena opened a guest house called the Pension Imbria, which became both her livelihood and a hub for her social network. She later converted Reinhard Heydrich's former summer house on the island into a restaurant, which she ran with her second husband until it burned down in February 1969. She then continued operating a boarding house. Running the pension brought Lena into contact with tourists, locals, and former acquaintances from her pre-1945 life. Several reports note that she maintained ties with families connected to the SS elite. Her loyalty to her husband and to the worldview they shared remained unmistakable throughout her life. She often portrayed herself as a misunderstood victim of the post-war climate. In interviews, she emphasized the hardships she faced as a widow and mother, while downplaying or dismissing the broader consequences of the regime her husband had served. In 1965, Lena remarried. Her second husband was Mauno Manninen, a Finnish poet, painter, and theatre director who was the son of poet Otto Manninen and writer Annie Swan. According to Finnish art historian Pirjo Hämäläinen, Manninen read an article about Lena Heydrich, became interested in her, and travelled to meet her. They married primarily so that Lena could change her surname, though the union lasted until Manninen's death in September 1969. In 1976, Lena published her memoir, Leben mit einem Kriegsverbrecher, Life with a War Criminal. The title was provocative, but the book's contents drew immediate criticism from historians. Critics argued that it presented an incomplete and selective account of Reinhard Heydrich's role in the RSHA. They noted that Lina shifted blame away from her husband, questioned established historical evidence, and emphasized his private qualities as a father and musician rather than his public actions as the architect of genocide. Historians still debate whether the memoir reflects genuine conviction, strategic self-presentation, or a mixture of both. Some view it as a calculated attempt to rehabilitate Heydrich's image. Others see it as the sincere expression of a woman who never accepted the moral judgment history had rendered on her husband. Public interest in Lina resurfaced in the 1970s and 1980s when journalists and researchers traveled to Fehmarn to interview her. One account, later cited in Crime Read's feature Interview with the Hangman's Wife, and based on journalist Nancy Dougherty's recorded conversations with Lina, described her firm defense of Reinhard Heydrich and her belief that history had judged him unfairly. According to Dougherty's interviews, Lina spoke with sharp recall and unwavering conviction, recounting details of her husband's life with precision. Observers noted that she showed little willingness to reinterpret the past, presenting a portrait of a woman whose beliefs remained unchanged across 4 decades. The debates surrounding her public statements touched on a broader question: how should post-war societies handle the testimonies of individuals who remained loyal to discredited regimes? Some scholars argue that Lina's interviews provide valuable insight into the mindset of families associated with the SS. Others caution that her accounts must be treated carefully, as they often challenge established historical research and archival evidence. The truth varies depending on whether one prioritizes archival documents, personal testimony, or scholarly interpretation. By the early 1980s, Lina's health had begun to decline, though she remained active in her guest house as long as possible. Her final years on Fehmarn were relatively quiet, marked by visits from friends and occasional discussions with researchers. She died on 14th August 1985, at age 74. She is buried on the island of Fehmarn. Her death closed a chapter that had spanned the rise of the Third Reich, its collapse, and 4 decades of post-war Germany. Her legacy remains controversial. To some, she symbolizes the persistence of loyalty among families tied to Nazi leadership, a woman who never renounced her husband's ideology or acknowledged his victims. To others, she represents the complexities of post-war identity and the challenges Germany faced in reconciling personal narratives with historical responsibility. The pension she received, the lenient Denazification verdict, and her unrepentant memoir all raised difficult questions about how West Germany handled the families of perpetrators in the decades after 1945. The post-war years reshaped the lives of the Heydrich children in ways none of them could have anticipated. Their father's reputation, their mother's loyalty, and the loss of their estate placed them in a difficult position in a society reckoning with its past. Each child followed a different path, shaped by personal choices and the weight of their surname. The eldest son, Klaus, did not live to see the end of the war. His death in the traffic accident on 24th of October 1943 occurred when he was just 10 years old. On that day, he and his brother Heide were cycling around the estate's grounds when Klaus saw the driveway gates were open and rode out into the road, where he was struck by a small truck carrying a local football team back from a match. The loss was devastating to Lina, who mentioned it repeatedly in interviews for the rest of her life. Hitler sent condolences, and SS figures attended the funeral, but Klaus's death marked the beginning of the family's disintegration even before the Reich itself collapsed. Heide Heydrich, born on 23 December 1934, became the most publicly known of the surviving children, though publicly known is a relative term, as he spent most of his life avoiding attention. After the family fled to Bavaria in 1945, Heide completed his schooling in the region and later pursued a career as an engineer. He eventually settled in Wannsee, a small community near Munich, where he lived as a retired engineer. For decades, Heide avoided public attention and declined interviews, choosing to keep his distance from discussions about his father's role in the war. In 2009, Heide made a rare exception and agreed to speak with John Martin, the author of The Mirror Caught the Sun, Operation Anthropoid 1942. In that conversation, he adopted a notably defensive stance toward his father. The interview revealed a man who had never fully come to terms with Reinhard Heydrich's legacy, neither embracing it openly nor condemning it publicly. In 2011, Heide briefly returned to public attention after he offered to support the restoration of the former family residence at Panenské Břežany in the Czech Republic. The proposal drew strong reactions. The property remains closely associated with Reinhard Heydrich's wartime administration, and local officials noted that Heydrich had left the estate as a child in 1945 and viewed his offer through a complex lens. Some commentators argued that restoring the property with his involvement risked overlooking the suffering experienced under Nazi occupation. Others saw the gesture as a possible form of acknowledgement rather than tribute. The controversy highlighted how the Heydrich name continued to provoke strong emotions more than 6 decades after the war's end. The two youngest children, Silke and Marte, maintained far more private lives than their brother. Reliable information about Silke is scarce. Born on 9 April 1939, she was only 6 years old when the war ended. One unconfirmed online report suggests she may have emigrated to the United States, but no verified sources support this claim. Her life after the war remains largely undocumented, a deliberate retreat from the public record. Marte, the youngest, was born on 23 July 1942, 6 weeks after her father's death. She never knew Reinhard Heydrich. She now goes by the surname Bayer and still lives on Fehmarn, where she owns a small clothing shop in the town of Burg. Like her brother Heydrich, she does not give interviews. In one remark published in the German magazine Stern, she noted that people cannot imagine what it is like to have such a father, and that his name follows her day and night. The statement captured the impossible inheritance of children born to the architects of genocide, burdened by a name they cannot escape and a history they did not choose. Family perspectives on the Heydrich legacy vary sharply. Marte's son, also named Reinhard, has expressed the view that no one truly knows the full extent of what his grandfather did. This measured agnosticism contrasts with the firm positions taken by other branches of the family. Peter Thomas Heydrich, the son of Reinhard's brother Heinz, took a very different path. Born on 2nd March 1931, he became a well-known German cabaret performer, specializing in reciting the work of Jewish poets such as Heinrich Heine, Kurt Tucholsky, and Walter Mehring. In a way, he saw himself as continuing the expiation his own father had begun at the end of World War II. The story of Heinz Heydrich, Reinhard's younger brother, represents one of the most striking moral contrasts within the family. Heinz was born on 29 September 1905 in Halle an der Saale, the youngest of the 3 Heydrich children. As a youth, he engaged his older brother Reinhard in mock fencing duels and often protected him from bullies who taunted Reinhard about his high-pitched voice and rumored Jewish ancestry. Heinz was initially a fervent admirer of Hitler and joined the SS himself, becoming an Obersturmführer, a lieutenant. He served as a journalist and publisher of the soldiers' newspaper Die Panzerfaust. Everything changed in June 1942. Before Reinhard's state funeral in Berlin, Heinz was given a large packet containing his brother's personal files, released from his strongbox at Gestapo headquarters at 8 Prinz Albrecht Strasse. Heinz shut himself away in his room with the papers. His wife noticed that he sat up all night burning the documents. The next morning, Heinz could not be engaged in conversation. His wife remembered that he seemed to be elsewhere mentally, like stone. The files were probably Reinhard's personal records, from which Heinz understood for the first time in all its enormity the systematic extermination of the Jews, the so-called final solution that his brother had coordinated. The revelation transformed him. Thereafter, Heinz used his position as editor of Die Panzerfaust to help Jews escape from Nazi-occupied Europe. He forged identity documents using the newspaper's commercial printing presses, signing, stamping, and distributing them to Jewish families so they could reach safety. In November 1944, an economic commission headed by a state attorney investigated the editorial staff of Die Panzerfaust. Heinz believed he had been discovered and shot himself to protect his family from the Gestapo. Ironically, the attorney knew nothing about the forgeries. He was only investigating paper supply shortages. However, according to his nephew Heydrich, Heinz committed suicide because of a pending court-martial case against him for theft and corruption. Whatever the precise circumstances, Heinz Heydrich died on 19th November 1944 and is buried in the war cemetery of Riesenburg. Peter Thomas Heydrich wrote a book about his childhood, father and uncle, completed after his death by his friend Hans-Georg Wiedemann and published in 2006 as Ich war der Kronprinz von Heydrich. Eine Kindheit im Schatten des Henkers von Prag. He was Heydrich's crown prince, a childhood in the shadow of the executioner of Prague. In the book, Peter described how, as a youth, he enjoyed the fame of being a crown prince, as the nephew of Reinhard Heydrich. During boyhood, he thought of his uncle as a successful sportsman and sensitive musician. In Prague, Peter observed that his uncle had become a bigwig. He derived many privileges from the connection. Even after the war, Peter still felt some pride in the familial relationship, if not so, openly. But finally, Peter had to admit that Reinhard Heydrich was an evil man who planned and executed the Holocaust and other crimes. In interviews, he stated publicly that he found it unfortunate that Reinhard's children never distanced themselves. The Heydrich family story is not just about one man's crimes, but about what comes after. The long aftermath of atrocity, the slow erosion of denial, and the weight that history places on those who did not choose it, but cannot escape it. If you found this video insightful, watch What Happened to Heinrich Himmler's Family After WWII next to learn how the family of the man who built the SS navigated the post-war world. Like this video, subscribe, and hit the bell for more History Inside. Thanks for watching.